The highway stretched endlessly, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren land. A light breeze carried dust across the road, swirling around the solitary figure sitting near the abandoned gas station. His fur, once thick and golden, had dulled with time, matted from years of exposure to the elements. Bob, a German shepherd, had become a fixture in this forgotten town, a silent sentinel waiting for someone who never returned. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. A ghost of the past. For 5 years, Bob had made this small patch of land his home. Summer's blistering heat, winter's bitter frost, relentless rains, none of it drove him away. Day after day, he sat in the same spot, his deep brown eyes locked onto the road ahead. Locals came to know him. Some tried to help, but Bob never accepted their offerings if they came too close. He would simply move a few feet away, settle back down, and resume his quiet vigil. Some whispered that he had once belonged to a trucker, a man who had stopped at the gas station every week like clockwork until one day he didn't. Others believed that Bob had once had a family in town, but they had moved away or worse, forgotten him. Yet, Martha Reynolds, the elderly diner owner, believed in a different truth. "He's waiting for someone," she often told customers at her diner, wiping her hands on her apron as she glanced out the window. "And I pray that one day they come back." An unsolved mystery. When Noah Patterson, a 32-year-old journalist, drove through town on a cold autumn morning, he hadn't planned on stopping. But something about the sight of Bob sitting motionless by the gas station stirred something deep within him. Pulling into the lot, Noah observed him. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared down the road as if expecting someone at any moment. Why? Noah headed into Martha's diner, the scent of coffee and sizzling bacon filling the air. He slid onto a stool, ordering a cup of coffee before finally asking, "That dog, how long has he been out there?" Martha sighed. 5 years. Noah leaned forward. "And no one knows where he came from?" "There are stories, sure, but no proof." She shook her head, watching Bob through the window. "That dog never leaves. It's like he's got a promise to keep." Digging into the past. Noah had covered missing person cases, survival stories, and tales of lost pets miraculously returning home. But this was different. Why would a dog remain in one place for so long, waiting? Determined to uncover the truth, Noah dug through old police reports, town records, and even social media posts. Then he found something. A news article. 5 years ago, a terrible car accident had occurred just outside of town. A family traveling cross-country, a mother, father, and their young son had crashed on the icy roads. The parents didn't survive, and their son was critically injured. But what caught Noah's attention was the last sentence in the report. The family dog, a German shepherd, was not found at the scene. The miracle that changed everything. Heart-pounding, Noah tracked down old hospital records and foster care reports. The boy Daniel Whitmore had survived but had no living relatives. He was placed into foster care and later adopted. He was now 15 years old, living in another state. Could it be? Noah made a desperate phone call, explaining the situation to the family. They were stunned. The boy, now a teenager, remembered having a German shepherd named Bob. "My parents got him for me when I was 6. Daniel's voice cracked over the phone. "We were on a road trip when it happened. He must have run away after the crash. I thought he was gone forever." That night, Noah couldn't sleep. He had seen countless stories of animals' loyalty, but nothing like this. Bob had spent 5 years waiting in the same spot, not knowing what had happened, but still hoping his family would return. The next morning, Noah arranged for Daniel and his adoptive parents to come to town. It had been years since Bob had seen his boy. Would he even remember? The moment that changed everything. The morning air was crisp as Daniel stepped out of the car, his heart pounding. Across the lot, Bob lay curled near the gas station, as he always had. But the moment Daniel whispered his name, everything changed. Bob's ears perked up, his head snapped in the direction of the voice. His body stiffened, and for the first time in years, his eyes lit up with recognition. Daniel took a hesitant step forward. "Bob, it's me." A beat of silence. Then, with a sound between a whimper and a howl, Bob launched himself forward. The elderly dog, once slow and weary, now ran like he had never aged a day. He crashed into Daniel, knocking him to the ground as he licked his face frantically, his tail wagging harder than it had in years. The entire town watched, stunned, as the dog who had refused to leave finally found what he had been waiting for. Tears streamed down Daniel's face as he held onto Bob, whispering, "I'm so sorry, buddy. I didn't know you were waiting." But Bob didn't care. He had waited through the storms, through the loneliness, through the pain. And now, his boy had come home. A town changed forever. The reunion was something no one in town would ever forget. Martha wiped her eyes as she watched from the diner. "I knew he was waiting for something," she whispered. Noah, watching from the sidelines, felt a lump in his throat. This wasn't just a story anymore. This was a miracle. Bob, now old and frail, would spend the rest of his days in comfort, surrounded by the love he had never stopped believing in. And for the first time in 5 long years, he left his spot by the gas station. His wait was over. The wind whispered across the abandoned gas station, carrying with it the scent of asphalt and distant memories. Bob sat in his usual spot, his golden brown fur dusted with time, his ears alert to every passing car. 5 years. 5 years of scorching summers, bitter winters, and lonely nights. He never moved from the spot. He was waiting. And now, Noah Patterson had found the truth. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. This was no stray. Bob was a dog who had once belonged to a loving family. A family that had no idea he was still here, still waiting for them. A love that never faded. 5 years earlier, Bob wasn't just a dog. He was Lucas Carter's best friend. From the moment the German Shepherd puppy entered the Carter home, Lucas, just 10 years old, had formed an unbreakable bond with him. Bob slept at the foot of Lucas's bed, waited by the door for him to come home from school, and never left his side. His mother, Emily Carter, would laugh whenever she saw them together. "I don't know who loves who more, you or Bob." His father, Benjamin Carter, wasn't a man of many words, but every evening when he came home, he would kneel down, rub Bob's ears, and murmur the same thing. "Good boy," looking out for the family. And Bob always did. Until the night everything changed. The night that stole everything. A storm rolled in fast, bringing rain so heavy it blurred the road ahead. The Carters were driving home from a weekend visit to Emily's parents. Lucas sat in the back seat, his small fingers absently stroking Bob's fur, the rhythmic patter of rain lulling him into a sense of peace. Then headlights appeared. Too close. Too fast. Emily screamed. The tires slid. Metal twisted. Glass shattered. And then silence. A lost soul in the storm. When Bob woke, his ears rang, his body ached, and the air was thick with smoke and fear. Through the chaos, he saw them, Lucas, being carried away by strangers. Paramedics rushed to pull Benjamin and Emily from the wreck. Bob barked frantically, trying to get to them. Someone grabbed him, tried to hold him back. Panic took over. He twisted, yanked, broke free, and ran. He ran until the world became unfamiliar, until he could no longer see Lucas, until the only thing left was an empty stretch of road. And so, he waited. He searched up and down the highway, sniffing for his boy, looking for the car, for the life that had been stolen from him. But they never came. So he found the gas station close enough to the accident site, offering shelter from the worst of the storms. And he waited. For 5 years. A journalist uncovers the truth. Noah Patterson's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his heart pounding. Bob wasn't a stray. He was a lost soul, holding on to the last place he had seen his family. And the Carters had no idea he was still alive. Noah took a deep breath, then reached for his phone. The call that changed everything. The phone rang once, twice. Then, a voice answered. "Hello? Mrs. Carter?" Noah's voice was careful, steady. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Noah Patterson. I'm a journalist, and I believe I've found someone you lost." A pause. Then, a quiet intake of breath. Lucas's voice, now 15 years old, came on the line next. Bob? Bob's alive? Noah swallowed hard. Yes, and he's been waiting for you. All this time. A reunion that stunned the world. The Carter family arrived the next morning. Lucas stepped out of the car first, his hands trembling, his breath unsteady. Bob sat in his usual spot, staring at the road, waiting. Then, he heard it. Bob. The dog froze. Lucas took one step forward. Bob, it's me. And the world shifted. Bob moved and ran. The dog who had never left his post for 5 years, the dog who'd ignored every stranger, sprinted like his heart would explode. Lucas barely had time to react before Bob crashed into him, knocking him to the ground, his tail wagging so hard it was a blur, his cries of joy filling the air. Emily fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Benjamin, the man of few words, choked out only two, "Good boy." The town had never seen anything like it. Even Martha from the diner wiped away tears, whispering, "I always knew he was waiting for someone." Loyalty that defied time. Bob's story is more than just a dog's loyalty. It's a lesson in love, faith, and the unbreakable bond between a heart that waits and the family that never stopped loving him. Even after all the years, even after the distance, he knew. Sometimes love never leaves. Sometimes it waits until the right moment, until the right voice calls it home again. The sky had begun to darken, streaks of orange and pink fading into twilight as Noah Patterson stood near the abandoned gas station. Bob sat in his usual spot, his worn-out fur rustling slightly in the evening breeze. His eyes remained fixed on the road, waiting just as he had for the past 5 years. But tonight was different. Tonight, his wait would finally end. Noah took a deep breath, gripping his phone tightly. He could still hear Emily Carter's choked sob through the call, the raw emotion in her voice when she realized their Bob was alive. "We're coming," she had said, her voice breaking. "We're coming right now." A 10-hour drive. That's how long Bob had left to wait. But what were 10 more hours when he had already waited 5 years? A town watches and waits. News of Bob's impending reunion spread like wildfire. Martha from the diner had already started telling customers, her eyes misty as she wiped her hands on her apron. "I always knew that dog had a story," she whispered. Truckers who had passed through the small town countless times, the ones who had left food for Bob when no one else did, began pulling over to watch, to wait. One man even parked his rig across the street, arms crossed as he muttered. It was no longer just Bob waiting. The whole town was waiting with him. The longest night. As the hours dragged on, Noah couldn't pull himself away. He sat near Bob, careful not to intrude on the dog's quiet vigil. Occasionally, Bob would look at him, his dark eyes filled with something deep, something unspoken yet painfully clear. Hope. The hope that had kept him here all this time. Noah had covered countless human interest stories in his career. Survival stories, reunions, second chances. But he had never seen anything like this. A dog who had every reason to move on, but instead chose to stay. Not because he was lost, but because he had faith. Faith that the ones he loved would come back. The call that changed everything. At 3:12 a.m., Noah's phone rang. He answered on the first ring. "We're 2 miles out." It was Lucas. His voice, now deeper than it had been 5 years ago, was trembling. Noah stood, stretching his stiff limbs, his heartbeat picking up. Bob, as if sensing something, lifted his head. The wait was almost over. Headlights in the dark. At 3:19 a.m., the first glow of headlights appeared down the road. Bob's ears perked up. His tail twitched, but he didn't move. Not yet. Then, the car slowed, pulling into the gas station. The doors flung open before the vehicle even stopped. A teenage boy, no longer the small child Bob had once known, stumbled out first. Bob. And then, the world shifted. A reunion that stunned the world. For the first time in 5 years, Bob moved. Not just the slow, methodical pacing he did when strangers got too close. Not just the hesitant steps he took when searching the road. This was different. This was recognition. Bob sprinted. Lucas barely had time to react before the 80-pound German Shepherd crashed into him, knocking him to the ground, his paws landing on Lucas's chest as he barked, whimpered, and licked the boy's face over and over again. Lucas sobbed into Bob's fur, his fingers digging deep, as if afraid to let go. "I thought you were gone," he choked out. "I thought I lost you." Bob let out a deep, mournful whimper, pressing his head against the boy's chest, as if to say, "I never left. I was waiting." Emily and Benjamin Carter stood frozen in shock, tears streaming down their faces. Benjamin, the man of few words, dropped to his knees beside Lucas and Bob. His hand trembled as he reached out, brushing through the dog's thick fur. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You never stopped looking out for us, did you?" Bob leaned into him, his tail wagging, his body trembling from overwhelming joy. Emily, unable to hold back any longer, wrapped her arms around them both. Noah had to wipe his own eyes. This wasn't just a reunion. It was a miracle. A love that never faded. The world had changed in the 5 years Bob had waited. Lucas had grown. Emily and Benjamin had moved to a new city, rebuilt their lives. But love never left. And Bob had never stopped believing in it. His body bore the scars of time. His fur, once vibrant, was faded in places. His once strong frame had grown leaner from years of survival. But when he looked up at Lucas, his eyes were the same. Going home. As dawn broke, the Carter family prepared to take Bob home. Lucas sat in the back seat just like he used to, his arms wrapped around his dog. Bob let out a contented sigh, resting his head on the boy's lap. Emily turned in the passenger seat, still struggling to believe it. "You never stopped waiting for us, did you?" she whispered. Bob's tail thumped softly against the seat. As Benjamin started the car, Lucas buried his face in Bob's fur once more. "We're never leaving you behind again," he murmured. "I promise." Bob closed his eyes, the warmth of his family finally surrounding him once more. And for the first time in 5 years, Bob wasn't waiting. He was going home. The cold morning air hung thick with anticipation. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting long shadows across the abandoned gas station. Bob stood still, his ears pricked, his eyes locked onto the distant headlights cutting through the darkness. For 5 years, he had waited, through seasons of scorching heat and brutal cold. But now, something was different. A car rolled onto the gravel lot, its tires crunching softly. The passenger door flung open before it even came to a complete stop. Emily Carter stepped out first. She clutched her coat tightly around her trembling body, her breath visible in the frigid air. Her wide, desperate eyes scanned the lot, searching. Benjamin Carter followed, slower, more hesitant. His hands were clenched at his sides, his normally stoic face struggling to contain the emotions threatening to break free. Then, the back door opened. A boy stepped out. Lucas. Now 14, taller, no longer the small child Bob had once known. But his eyes, the same hazel eyes that had once been Bob's whole world, were filled with a hope so fragile it might shatter. No one spoke. Bob stood like a statue, his muscles tense, his tail motionless. He stared at the 3 figures standing by the car, his expression unreadable. And then, "Duke," Emily whispered, her voice cracking. Bob's ears flicked. Lucas took a shaky breath and stepped forward. "It's me, buddy." Bob's nose twitched. He took a step forward, then another. And suddenly, he was running. Lucas dropped to his knees, opening his arms just as Bob crashed into him, burying his head against the boy's chest. "You waited," Lucas sobbed, clutching Bob as if he would disappear again. "You waited for us." Emily covered her mouth, choking back tears as she knelt beside them, her hands trembling as they stroked Bob's dusty fur. Benjamin's strong, stoic facade crumbled. He knelt, his fingers threading through Bob's thick coat, his voice breaking. "Good boy," he whispered. Good boy." Bob let out a sound, not quite a bark, Not quite a whimper, but something deeper, something raw. A sound of relief. The drive home. The road stretched endlessly ahead, yet the car felt warmer, fuller than it had in years. Bob curled up in the back seat beside Lucas, who never stopped running his fingers through the dog's fur. Every few minutes, he would whisper, "I missed you, buddy." Bob didn't lick his face or wag his tail like he once would have. But he didn't pull away either. That was enough for now. Emily stole glances at them through the rearview mirror, her grip on the steering wheel a little too tight. She had dreamed of this moment for years. Bringing Bob home. Completing their family again. But deep down, she knew. This wouldn't be simple. Bob had changed. He wasn't the same playful dog they had lost 5 years ago. He had spent too long alone, waiting, surviving. And trusting humans again wouldn't come easily. An unfamiliar home. By the time they reached the house, the sun had risen. Lucas unbuckled his seatbelt and turned to Bob, his voice soft. "We're home, boy." Bob lifted his head, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar house. It wasn't the home he remembered. After the accident, the Carters had moved from their small house in Wyoming to a bigger one in Denver, Colorado. It had a spacious backyard, tall wooden fences, and a brand new doghouse waiting for him. But to Bob, it wasn't home. Lucas stepped out first, then turned back, waiting. Bob hesitated. For the first time since finding them, he didn't run to them. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Benjamin, whose brows furrowed as he stepped forward, crouching near the open door. "Bob," he said gently, his voice steady but firm. "It's okay, boy. Come on." Bob's ears flicked, but he didn't move. Lucas crouched beside his father, his hands open, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now. I promise." For a moment, there was only silence. Then slowly, cautiously, Bob stepped out. His paw touched the pavement like it was foreign ground. His body remained tense, his ears flicking at every sound. Lucas didn't rush him. Instead, he simply stood, holding the door open and waiting. Learning to trust again. The first few days were a test of patience. Bob barely left the corner of the living room. He would watch them, silently, cautiously. He flinched at loud noises. He tensed whenever someone walked too close. Lucas never forced him. Instead, he waited, just like Bob had waited for them. Every night, Lucas would sleep on the floor beside him, whispering softly, "I love you, buddy. You're home now." On the third night, something changed. Lucas woke up to find Bob's head resting against his chest. For the first time in 5 years, Bob had finally let himself belong again. A love that never fades. Weeks passed, and Bob slowly came back to life. He started eating beside them instead of waiting until they left the room. His tail, stiff and uncertain, began wagging when Lucas walked through the door. One afternoon, Emily was in the kitchen when she heard it. The sound of paws sprinting down the hall. She turned just in time to see Lucas laughing, Bob chasing him like he used to, his eyes bright, his spirit unbroken. Tears burned her eyes as she whispered, "Welcome home, Bob." And this time, he was home. For good. Bob's final test, a journey of fear, trust, and home. The sharp crack of fireworks shattered the quiet afternoon air, sending a tremor through Bob's body. His ears flattened against his head, his tail dropped, and his eyes darted wildly in search of an escape. And then he ran. Lucas's heart lurched. "Bob, no!" But the German Shepherd was already halfway across the yard, his powerful legs carrying him toward the open gate. Lucas sprinted after him. His feet pounded against the ground, his lungs burned, but Bob was faster. Fear was driving him. Lucas could see it in the way his paws barely touched the earth, in the wild desperation in his eyes. Bob wasn't just running. He was escaping. Escaping back to the only life he knew. The life where he had waited. The life where he had survived alone. But Lucas wasn't going to let that happen. The moment Bob crossed the gate, Lucas threw himself forward, grabbing a handful of his thick fur. The force nearly knocked him off his feet. Bob yelped, twisting in panic, but Lucas held on with everything he had. "It's okay," he gasped. "Bob, it's okay." The dog thrashed, his instincts screaming at him to run, to find shelter, to wait like he had for the past 5 years. Lucas could feel his hands shaking as he tightened his grip. "Please, buddy. Look at me." Bob's breath came in short, panicked bursts. His eyes darted toward the road, toward the gas station, toward the life he had left behind. Lucas stepped in front of him, blocking his view. "Not anymore," he whispered. He let go, and he waited. Bob stood frozen, his entire body trembling, his legs tensed, ready to bolt. But Lucas didn't chase him. He simply opened his arms. "Come home," he said softly. "You don't have to wait anymore." The fireworks had stopped. The air was still, and for the first time since he had returned, Bob wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at Lucas. His ears twitched, his paws shifted uncertainly. Lucas held his breath, and then Bob took a step forward. Lucas's heart slammed against his ribs. Another step, and then another, until finally, Bob pressed his head against Lucas's chest. The boy let out a shaky laugh, wrapping his arms around the dog's thick neck. "You stayed?" Lucas whispered. Tears burned his eyes. "You finally stayed. A new beginning." That night, Bob didn't curl up by the back door. He didn't pace the house, waiting for an escape. Instead, he lay beside Lucas's bed, his breathing slow, steady, safe. Lucas reached down and ran his fingers through Bob's fur. "You're home, buddy." Bob let out a deep sigh. And for the first time in 5 years, he believed it. The road forward. Bob's journey didn't end that night. There were still moments of hesitation, still flickers of doubt, but with each passing day, he trusted a little more. He greeted Emily at the door without flinching. He let Benjamin scratch behind his ears without pulling away. And one morning, as Lucas opened the back door, Bob stepped outside on his own. No fear, no running, just home. A love that never left. Months passed, and the past became just that, the past. The town that had watched Bob wait for years now watched him live. He ran through the backyard with Lucas, barking at squirrels. He curled up by the fireplace on cold winter nights. He wagged his tail when Emily poured his food. And every now and then, Lucas would catch him staring at the road. Not waiting, just remembering. Bob had spent 5 years looking for home. And now, he finally knew. He had never been lost. He had just been waiting to be found. For 5 long years, Bob had waited. Through scorching summers, freezing winters, endless storms, and the silence of lonely nights, he remained in the same spot, staring down the road, waiting for someone who never came back. But now, after so much time, he had come home. Yet home didn't feel like home. The ghost of the past. Bob wasn't the same hopeful young dog who had once curled up at the foot of Lucas's bed. He wasn't the same joyful pup who had chased after sticks and rolled in the grass, barking happily at the world around him. That Bob had disappeared the night of the accident. This Bob had spent years surviving, relying only on himself. He had waited on cold pavement, through hunger and exhaustion, believing, knowing that one day his family would return. Now that they had, he wasn't sure what to do. Lucas watched as Bob paced near the back door, his tail low, his ears flicking at every sound. It had been weeks since they brought him home, but he still hesitated, still glanced at the door as if waiting for the moment when everything would be taken away again. Lucas understood. Bob wasn't afraid of them. He was afraid of losing them. And so, just like Bob had waited for them, Lucas waited for him. A step toward trust. The first breakthrough happened one cold morning. Lucas had woken up early, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he padded downstairs. He expected to find Bob in his usual spot, curled up by the back door, waiting. But this time, he wasn't there. Lucas's breath caught as he scanned the living room. Then he saw it. Bob was curled up on his dog bed. Not by the door, not near an escape route. On his bed, inside. Lucas didn't move. He barely breathed. It was the first time Bob had chosen to stay. He grabbed his phone with trembling hands and sent a text to his mom upstairs. "Mom," He's sleeping on his bed. Seconds later, her reply came. Don't wake him. Let him feel safe. Lucas set his phone down and sat on the floor a few feet away, watching as Bob slept peacefully in his home for the first time in 5 years. Learning to belong again. The next few weeks brought small victories. Bob ate regularly. He wagged his tail more. He let Emily stroke his fur without flinching. But there was still hesitation, especially with doors. Whenever someone opened the back door, Bob's muscles tensed, his ears flicked forward, and for a split second, he looked like he was about to run. Lucas noticed it every time. His parents said Bob needed more time, that he had spent so long waiting to be reunited, he wasn't sure how to stop waiting. Lucas wasn't worried about time. He was worried about what would happen if Bob ever got the chance to leave. The test. One crisp autumn afternoon, the sky painted soft shades of gold and blue. Lucas dropped his backpack by the door and bent down to scratch Bob's ears. Want to go outside, buddy? Bob tilted his head. Lucas smiled. Come on, let's try it. He'd been waiting for this moment for weeks. They had kept Bob on a leash every time they took him outside, ensuring he wouldn't panic and run. But today, Lucas wanted to see if Bob could finally trust that this was his home. Slowly, he walked to the back door and opened it. Bob stepped forward cautiously, sniffing the air. Lucas stepped onto the porch, watching carefully. Go on. Bob's ears twitched, his paws pressed against the grass, and he took a few careful steps forward, looking around the backyard. Then a loud crash. Fireworks. The sharp, echoing explosion sent shockwaves through Bob's body. Lucas saw it instantly, the way Bob froze, the way his muscles locked, the way his ears pinned back. Another explosion. Lucas's stomach dropped. Bob, wait. But fear was faster. The choice. Bob's instincts took over. He bolted. Lucas's heart pounded as he sprinted after him. Bob, stop. The dog was already halfway across the yard, heading toward the open gate. Lucas's chest tightened. He should have closed it. His legs burned as he pushed himself forward, but Bob was quicker. For the first time in weeks, survival instincts overpowered everything else: the fireworks, the open space, the panic. He slipped through the gate and onto the sidewalk. Lucas's voice broke as he shouted, Bob, W-A-I-T. Bob skidded to a stop. For a long, breathless second, he stood at the edge of the street. Lucas saw the conflict in his eyes. 5 years of waiting. 5 years of looking for something lost. 5 years of believing that if he left, maybe he would find what he had been searching for. Lucas's voice was desperate. Don't go. Bob looked back at him. And then, he made his choice. Bob turned around. Lucas exhaled sharply, his hands shaking as he crouched down. It's okay, buddy. I'm right here. Bob took one step toward him, then another. And then, with a soft whimper, he pressed his head into Lucas's chest. Lucas wrapped his arms around him, his voice thick. You're home. And for the first time, Bob truly believed it. The road to healing. That night, Bob didn't sleep by the door. He didn't pace, didn't wait, didn't flinch. Instead, he lay beside Lucas's bed, his breathing slow, steady, safe. Lucas reached down, running his fingers through Bob's fur. You're home, buddy. Bob let out a deep sigh. And for the first time in 5 years, he stayed. A love that never left. The town that had once watched Bob wait for years now watched him live. He ran through the backyard, barking at squirrels. He curled up by the fireplace on cold winter nights. He wagged his tail when Emily poured his food. And every now and then, Lucas would catch him staring at the road. Not waiting, just remembering. Bob had spent 5 years looking for home. And now, he finally knew. He had never been lost. He had just been waiting to be found. The lessons of Bob's story, loyalty, resilience, and the power of love. Bob's journey is more than just a story about a dog who waited. It is a reflection of the human experience. His unwavering loyalty, his resilience in the face of uncertainty, and his eventual return home mirror the struggles many of us go through in life. Whether we realize it or not, We all have a little bit of Bob inside us. We wait. We search. We hold on to hope even when everything tells us to let go. And sometimes we have to learn to trust again, even when the past has left us broken. How often do we find ourselves waiting for something or someone, convinced that things will return to how they used to be? Maybe it's a lost friendship, a fractured family bond, or even a version of ourselves that existed before life changed us. Just like Bob, we sit in the same place, physically or emotionally, believing that if we hold on long enough, everything will make sense again. But life moves forward, and sometimes we need to make a choice to stay in the past or to step forward into the future. Bob had to learn that his family never abandoned him. They had simply been waiting for him in a new place. We too must recognize that moving forward doesn't mean letting go of love, it means embracing a new chapter. Bob's hesitation when he finally returned home is something many of us can relate to. After years of hardship, we build walls, just like he did. We fear that if we trust too easily, we'll be hurt again. But healing takes time. Just as Lucas waited patiently for Bob to feel safe, the people who love us, truly love us, will give us time to rebuild. The key is allowing ourselves to accept that love when it finally reaches us. Another powerful lesson from Bob's story is the importance of resilience. Life is unpredictable. Accidents happen. People leave. Circumstances change. But Bob never gave up. Despite the harsh winters, hunger, and loneliness, he held on to the belief that love was still out there. And in the end, he was right. How many of us have been through dark times where we felt abandoned, lost, or hopeless? Yet, like Bob, if we keep going, if we keep believing life has a way of surprising us. Lastly, Bob's story is a reminder that love, in its truest form, is patient, unwavering, and forgiving. His family never stopped loving him, even when they thought he was gone. When he finally came home, they didn't expect him to be the same. They gave him the space to heal, to trust again. That's what love does. It doesn't demand immediate perfection. It doesn't force or rush healing. It simply waits, ready to embrace when the time is right. In the end, Bob didn't just find his family, he found himself again. And maybe that's what we're all searching for, too. If this story touches your heart, take a moment to reflect on the power of resilience and love. Together, we can celebrate the bonds that make life extraordinary. Don't forget to subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more incredible stories.